So, I just kind of echo Don's push for advocacy in this field because I think it is something that could really be actionable.
Capitol Hill, where
and I'll just name
Politics is a game of inches. And it was like, to hell with that. Who wants to play a game of inches? I want to set the goalposts. And part of what you're doing when you're in a radical movement is you're trying to change the goalposts. No, there's a real movement. You're advocating for something radically different. Will you see inches in a better direction? And that's a worthwhile victory. Like every inch counts. That's life getting a little bit better, the world getting a little freer. And so it shouldn't be dispiriting to think how much is stacked up against us. It should be empowering to think, yeah, well, maybe I can keep the start getting the trajectory going the other way.
I want to stress it takes intellectual work to figure out what are inches in the right direction. Even if in some sense you already know what the right end state is, what are the inches towards it? What are the particular things that would be movement in that direction? It's hard to tell. Don, you gave the example of, was repealing the individual mandate in Obamacare a step in the right or the wrong direction? I'm inclined to think in the wrong direction because it increases the other elements of force of the law, but I'm not sure. But the point is, it's not just here's one bit of force down. The way force works is that it's a system, and it's a system that's, well, let me just give the example that came up today. How do we think about Medicare? And since Michael had a different view from some of the other panelists before, in what ways is it exercising force on us? Well, here's an obvious way. It's stealing all of our money. It's stealing everybody's money, whatever percent of their paycheck is, all across their lives, so that when they're older, or so that for older people now, which is actually what's happening, medical care can be given for free. So that's an obvious way in which force is executed there. But then, what else does it do? Is it also exercising force when it gives people free health care? Would it be better if it stole that money and didn't give free people free health care? What about different changes on the terms of which it gives people health care? Is it coercing when it has certain rules about what doctors can be paid for and what they can't, and what kind of doctors can? If you get medical care payments, could you get it for dealing with the same patient or different patients? What about these procedures are paid for but these ones aren't? Is there force there? And I think, yeah, there is. It's not just that they took all this money out, which is a real issue of force. It's also that they've now reshaped and restructured a whole industry. If I want to go into business selling healthcare to old people, who are the primary people who need healthcare, right, or a large section of them, I can't do that now because the whole clientele has had all the money they would use to pay me to do it stolen from them, and they were given a free service that purports to do this, and they can't afford to use me separately. Or maybe they can for some of them who are particularly rich and particularly dedicated to getting a different kind of healthcare, but not any kind of economy of scale. So the kind of business I could start by providing healthcare to elderly people is radically different in a world where socialized medicine for the aged exists, which is what we have now, versus in a world where it doesn't. And given that medicine for the aged is so much of medicine, that means it's about every kind of medicine you can do. Likewise, if you can't work in a hospital without being able to treat aged people, and nobody can run a hospital without having those people there, then any kind of work that requires being in a hospital, at least requires it under the current economic circumstances, is not something you can do free of Medicare. So I think it's really important to think about how is this force operating and ramifying throughout the whole profession, and what would it look like to change it? And so I think, for example, you don't want a situation where you're just giving people more and more Medicare dollars and they could always bid the price up and so forth. But you want to think, what would be the things that would make this system of having nationalized healthcare for the elderly, have more escape clauses for it, more loopholes to it? How can we let more old people get out of it and not pay that way? How can we let doctors who participate in it, since it exists and it's the only way to practice certain kinds of medicine, also practice other kinds of medicine at the same time, so that you can have something growing that competes with it, that you can have something like Uber, and you don't have a law like, if you've ever taken a taxi cab, you can't ride in an Uber, or if you've ever driven one, you can't drive in the other. But the meta point here isn't, so this is me disagreeing with Michael on something from earlier, but the meta point is these are the kinds of questions that we have to think about. It's not obvious, even if we both have the same view of what the ultimate free healthcare system would look like, what are the particular obstacles to it now? What particular changes would be changes in the right direction? And then one other thing I want to stress, I think it's really toxic to think of any kind of career or type of business as the bad guys in healthcare. Even to think of the FDA as the bad guys in a way. In a way, I think they are. The organization shouldn't exist. But what's happened isn't that there's some group of mustache-twirling villains who are trying to ruin things, whether it's the politicians or whether it's the doctors who are trying to pad their profits or the insurance companies who are trying to pad their profits or the patients who want something for nothing or whoever it might be. We're in a situation where we're not able to interact with one another in the way that human beings need to interact with one another to achieve their values in life. We're not able to figure out what we want out of healthcare, to set our goals, to figure out who we can go to get it from. If you're somebody who wants to provide healthcare, you're not able to think about, what do I want to provide? How can I find willing people to pay me for it? And so forth. Or you are in little pockets, but we need to expand those pockets. And everybody, and likewise, if you want to be someone who what you want to do with your life is figure out which drugs are safe and effective and give people advice on that and have a real impact in which drugs are taken and which ones aren't because they're safe and effective, where are you going to go to do that? If you're either going to go to the FDA or you're going to go to do it in some lab or in some company or something whose policies are wholly shaped by the FDA because they're the only game in town, because they're the only game that's allowed to be in town. So it's not that there's some concentration of bad people or people with ill will. There are some, of course, somewhere, but it's rather that none of us are allowed to live in the way we're supposed to live in this field, in the way that is life-sustaining, in the way that is benevolent, in a way that is dealing with people by trade in win-win interactions. And of course, everywhere there are some people who like that fact they're trying to get away with something. But in every field, in every profession within healthcare and in the clients of healthcare services, I think there are more people who like what they're doing, who came into this because they want to do something important and interesting with their life that creates value, and people who are consuming it looking for ways to get the greatest value out of it. And what one has to do, I think, at the fundamental level is clarify to everybody involved that that's the stake. There are values here to be produced and values here to be consumed. That's how values work. That requires the mind and it requires freedom. And in effect, you have nothing to lose from freedom but your chains and your sickness and your early death. And how can we, convey that message? How can we rally people to do that? I think these are the questions that Don's raising. But I think it's important not to vilify industries, types of business. You can vilify certain organizations like guilds that are functioning as guilds, but not like it's the doctors or it's the insurance companies or it's the big pharma or it's the people regulating, not in the sense of regulating by force, but who want to make their career goal the figuring out which things are safe and effective, which now, the problem is now we're doing that and all of these other things by force. So let's open it up.
One of the reasons why not to do that is that it has the implication of it's totally right for us to demand free healthcare and the government protect us from bad decision making, but it's the greedy doctors and companies that mess up our whole beautiful plan and make it not work. It lets us off the hook and says, yeah, you shouldn't have to demand freedom and take responsibility for navigating your way through life. And so it's unjust, but it's also it doesn't get at the real issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, Amesh, is there anything more to say in terms of specifics? What would that look like?
So there are two questions. One is that no country has achieved the kind of medical freedom or has really moved towards it in recent memory that we're talking about. Does that mean it's hopeless? Well, human beings have been around for how long now? Does anyone know the number? 400,000 years. So for all of that time except the last 200 years and a couple of other little brief glimmers of exceptions here and there, people have been ruled brutally by tribal chiefs, kings, emperors, slave drivers, and various other brutes. They've not been free to use their mind and live, and they've been poor and miserable, with almost no progress in almost all of that time. And we've had just a brief window of radical improvement in human life. That again led to a doubling of the human lifespan, led to a tremendous enrichment of spiritual values. I should mention, in all those times ruled by tribal chieftains and popes and kings, life was spiritually poor, despite what conservatives want to tell you. It was nasty, brutish, short, poor. It's only recently that we've had any little bit of freedom and gotten to witness what it can do. And then we've seen that freedom kind of growing and expanding in some areas and aspects of life, while it's been being pared back in others. So we've not been at trying this very long as a species. We've been trying the other way for almost all of our history, to live like beasts, brutalizing one another. And we've only just tried for a couple of 100 years living like human beings, living like creatures who live by our minds and who need to therefore deal with one another by trade and by respecting one another's rights. And we've done it imperfectly in these last couple of 100 years, and in some fields done it a lot worse than others. But we're really early in the trying to persuade people to do this. Really early if you think about the scope of human history. So yeah, I don't have much good news on the scale of the last 10, 20, 50, even 100 years here. But if you look at it on the scale of the species, on the scale of what's been tried, we haven't been at this long. To the limited extent we have been at it, we've doubled the human lifespan and made everything else so much better. And it's way too early to give up. And then the question is, what are the steps like to improve it? And Don, I think, has given us a lot of examples of what a start would be. There are other things we would need a lot of comparison of how it's been in other countries. One thing that should be discovered is, are there any places that have gotten freer in medicine recently? And not only can we learn from their example, but can we take the evidence of like how it worked then? What are the bits of good news that we can use to build on? So there's not ever really been an actual principled pro-freedom medicine movement. There's been a movement to socialize medicine that's been successful the world over. And there's been a handful of people kind of doing a sort of rear guard, maybe not so quick kind of thing. And then one or two people saying, no, we need a principled alternative, but not people who have devoted their lives to working it out, to working out the program, to working out how to fight for it. This is something that has to be started, not something that we've been at and failing at for millennia or even decades.
So I have just follow up. So with that,
That's a really good question.
so I'm wondering if it, or does it just all have to kind of happen at the same time? Just fight for it and then.
In other words, is it just you have a fight for freedom or a fight for capitalism? You don't have a particular medical branch of it. And then you wait for that side to win, and it'll take care of this field like every other field. Like, I don't think we think, you don't need a free market tires movement. Like, just general free market and capitalism and pro-liberty movement will take, you don't need a special, specialist in tires. The market for tires, I'm sure, has lots of controls on it in various ways it could be better. But we don't think, we don't cut that fine when we advocate for things. And do we need a movement specific to medicine? I think we do, because we have a lot of specific healthcare policy, because medicine is particularly important, and because it's been a particular target of the collectivizers. But I also think any kind of movement like that has to be integrated into a broader pro-freedom movement. So there needs to be, and there is a burgeoning, but small pro-freedom movement in the world. And it has to have some people focusing on the medical front, as there are some people focusing on other fronts.
And I think I would just add to that, in my talk, I put up that quote from Senator Ted Kennedy, which says healthcare is not just another commodity. Just combating that, I think, really, the fact that that's being selected out gives credence to what Greg just said, that there has to be a separate thrust in the medical healthcare field. And then I think just combating that idea in and of itself, or just enunciating it starts that process going forward, because you have to start thinking about, because you mentioned healthcare is tied up so much with altruism and all that, but you have to start thinking about this being a commodity like everything else, any other service that people do, and then that sort of gets people on thinking about it in a completely different way than they've been taught forever, that this is not something that can be considered any other commodity. So that's just one point that I think makes makes it clear to people where you're coming from and where the goal is.
And you have to valorize and spiritualize commodities. I mean, suppose somebody said, I don't know, about someone, well, she's not just a woman. Like as though a woman was some awful thing to be, but she's okay because she's not. No, the problem isn't the claim. There's something really wrong in the way commodities are viewed and services are viewed by someone who says, this thing's good, it's not just another service. Services are commodities, producing things are what life is about.
Just to put a quick spin on the point
go
that
to
you
phone,
made,
yeah.
Greg, but from a different perspective, part of how freedom is attacked is, well, look what happens in healthcare when you're free. So you need both, right? Part of the case for freedom is like the case for healthcare, and part of the way that you promote healthcare freedom is the broader case for freedom. And so I think there's a number of issues like that where you couldn't defend freedom without really specifying it and defending it in a particular area. And this is one of them, in part for the reasons you named, is that the stakes are so high.
Colleen?
Don and Amish touched on this a little bit, but like where I am in New York, I'm surrounded completely by people who both think that we should have a single payer system, and also that the system that we're currently in is a capitalist system. I think one really huge thing to combat is just that idea that we are like the failing capitalist system, which we aren't, right? And I think that was the point and a little bit of your talk, Amish, or one of the points that you made, but I think it bears repeating that even just saying over and over again, our system is not capitalist for the following reasons, it may help to kind of move the needle a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's important. That's kind of what the theme was to show that this isn't a free market system. And I think in many ways the U.S. has in some ways the worst of both worlds. Sometimes I say that we're not, there's not single payer, but then we've got all of these other kind of quasi-government things that make it even harder to navigate than it would be if it was a single payer. So it's just a really mongrel mix of socialized medicine with some slivers of freedom, and I think most people don't get that. They still think it is. And that's why they oppose Obamacare. So the Republicans will oppose Obamacare so vociferously. But if you say something about Medicare, that's all off. Medicare, nobody's going to touch your Medicare. That's what.
Yeah.
Ray?
Ben asked the last panel why I was more thinking of rethinking healthcare during this pandemic, and I was very curious what Amish thought about that.
And I want to hear both Amish and Colleen on that, as people who've both been.
So I think that the pandemic did create a lot of thinking during the pandemic. So we knew that our system wasn't going to be able to hold, and they had to expand capacity. They had to suspend certificate of need laws and allow people to open beds. They had to expand telemedicine, where because before Medicare wouldn't pay for telemedicine, they had to expedite training, graduate medical students faster. They had to allow licenses to be used across state lines.
Eventually they fudged EMTALA a little bit, that rule that Amish brought up about the emergency, you must see everyone, you must provide emergency, you must provide care to everyone who comes in an evaluation. We actually ended up turning people away, but we were never sure about it, right? Like when they sort of like waived EMTALA, but then we were like, well, I don't know. Like if we really waive EMTALA, they're gonna come and get us in the end. So we played with it a little, but we did meet people at the door and said, you have COVID, go home. You're not sick enough.
Yeah, so there was lots of that, and then even expanded scope of practice. We had pharmacists prescribing Paxlovid, pharmacists giving vaccines. In some states, they weren't allowed to give vaccines to children, but that got waived. We had, I think, and then obviously Operation Warp Speed and the way the FDA moved very proactively with the manufacturers all the way through, so things got done very quickly, using emergency use authorizations pretty liberally, home tests for COVID, which it took. The last home test we had for an infectious disease was HIV, which took 10 years to get through FDA. This got through very, very quickly as all of us were advocating. So all of that happened, and some of that is going to stay. And then so that's all the good stuff that happened during COVID, if there were anything good, those types of innovations. And on the other side of it, they did expand Medicaid in many states. So as part of the ACA or Obamacare, states could expand Medicaid, and some states hadn't, but they all expanded Medicaid during COVID. And that's a lesson that the other side has taken, that look, this was important because those people got health care. So there has been a lot of thinking about this. And I would say even in the last week, there's been movement on telemedicine where Medicare is saying they're going to keep that. And we have Project Next Gen, which is about vaccine development, moving it faster, which is a carry-on of Operation Warp Speed. There are people saying there should be Operation Warp Speed for every disease, which and the FDA should work that way all the time. So I think that there is some rethinking of healthcare, but not wholesale. It's just little things that made things work better during COVID-19, but not anything that is going to be as radical as let's lift limits on healthcare savings accounts. Let's allow people to work outside the Medicare system and not be beholden to these certain rules.
And even the licensing component, right, that they relaxed the licensing component, right, like doctors and nurses that were able to work outside of their state and things like that. Those things have, now that the pandemic is over, those relaxed rules are gone. And it's interesting because it's possible that if there had been a push for it, we would have been able to keep them because there were no real bad outcomes as a result of it. But it's just kind of, I think, Greg, you said medicine is ossified, and it's just part of the ossification of medicine that things kind of revert back to where they were. And I also think, like I was saying a little bit, like on the ground, when it comes to things like all of the reasons for burnout, I think I'm talking loud.
I wanted the world to hear it.
Like, we talk a little bit about, like all these things go around about like burnout in medicine all the time. And a lot of that is actually, Greg, what you were getting to, like the impossibility of having, of trading value for value, right? Of going into a patient interaction as a physician and providing a value and providing like the clinical care that you intend to provide because of like whatever is going on in the system. And conversely, as a patient, the difficulty of getting some value, the value that you're looking for out of that interaction. I think that's kind of where a lot of the unhappiness in medicine is, and a lot of that is built into many of the like little aspects of the system, like how awful residency is and how difficult it is to like work in a hospital system, and none of those things have been addressed. I think
One of the things also would need to be addressed to draw lessons from COVID is what are the features of our medical system that made it so vulnerable? Why was it the case that hospitals could get so overrun? With a type of event that we knew could happen, you were involved in all kinds of planning exercises for this, and you knew exactly what hospitals were going to get overrun before they did, right? So, why is it that this kind of thing could happen? Why don't we have the kind of flexibility in the system to bounce back more quickly? There has to be a post-mortem from the perspective of medical freedom on the failures in COVID. And I think particularly the failures of the hospital system, why we were under such stress that we thought we had to social distance to maintain capacity in the system. Why didn't we have a more flexible medical system? What things would have made it more flexible? And there's not been much reading or research or writing on that, and that's a topic that I think is ripe for someone to do. I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think the lesson that the people are drawing is the wrong one. They'll say that hospitals are now like hotels, and they want to move everything quickly, fast. They want to keep their beds as full as possible, no excess capacity, and they want to move lots of things outpatient that could be inpatient, so that decreases their footprint, so they're lean, mean, and kind of have these just-in-time principles that they took from Toyota or wherever it might be, so that they become more corporate. And that's what left us vulnerable. And they don't spend so much time talking about how hard it is for a hospital to expand capacity, how hard it is to hire nurses, how hard it is to get personnel and licensures and health departments that license, state health departments that license health hospitals. All of that stuff is kind of gone. It's all, this is the result of corporatization of medicine, even though it's not really the whole story. And medicine hospitals became like hotels in response to, I think, some of the other the government insurance market forces that were out there. But no one is looking at that as a solution. I think there has been some pushback on people understand the hospital capacity as being a problem, but they haven't come up with a good solution to it. And now, on top of that, post-COVID, we have a healthcare workforce shortage, which is made it much harder for them to even think about expanding capacity, doctors and nurses, but yet they don't think about, well, why don't we loosen immigration rules so that we can get more nurses from other countries? That's not even on the table. Or doctors, yeah.
We have 10,000 person gap between the number of residency spots and the number of graduating medical students, right?
And some of us in the field say this is what they knew this was going to happen, and it wasn't bad enough for them to change. Even though 1.1 million people died in the United States, that it wasn't bad enough. They only cared about it because it was affecting their political power. That the Trump administration, the Biden administration, it's still not that important to them. Only so much as it's a political issue. As it's a political issue, that's when they want to. Then they wanted to take care of it, but they want it off their plate now because it's not as important as negotiating with China or North Korea or whatever. All of those other issues that politicians like to talk about. That this isn't something that they want to fix. That it's still not a big enough of a problem. And they took care of it, they think, and until the next time. And they have this idea that this is a 100-year event, but the microbial world doesn't like have a clock and say, okay, we're going to go to sleep for 100 years. It could be happening now. So it's very frustrating because I'm in these discussions every day.
I wanted to give you a chance, Don, to expand on the idea of one of the mistaken premises of current framework, how we think about healthcare, is that the interests of doctors and patients are fundamentally misaligned. Because I think that's one of the reasons this area has been so vulnerable to collective victimization, is people fundamentally don't trust the profit motivation, the profit motive when incentives are misaligned. And naively, between me and my dentist,
It looks kind of like the incentives are misaligned because he only makes money when I have a cavity. So could you speak more to that?
Well, in a certain perspective, it's just it's the conventional view of selfishness in general, right? It's that incentives are always misaligned because my good does not consist of dealing with you as an independent equal, but it's I'd benefit from your sacrifices and you'd benefit from my sacrifices. And then in the medical context, it's that you have a situation in which one side is seen as having, the knowledge, the wealth, right? They're wealthy doctors broadly that will often be, but like that's the powerful side, and it's the patient who's vulnerable and lacks the kind of knowledge and capability of dealing with it. And so that's the conflict, is that one side is in need and the other side is capable of fulfilling those needs. And so that puts them in the position to extract rewards and advantages to their interests. And so the only thing unique about it is the kind of particular contours of the way in which they're supposed to have interests at odds with the person. But it's altruism in ways that we see it throughout, any business and its customer. It's the same kind of dynamic.
I don't think it's any more plausible that, the oncologists are out there rooting for there to be more cancer so they could have more business than that the, glaziers are the ones smashing windows and the, supermarkets are promoting famine so that they could, it's, anybody wants to sell you something, you have to lack the thing for them to want to sell you it. But it's part of human life that there are lots of things we lack all the time. They have to be produced. We don't automatically have any of the things we need, and people go into business producing them, and that's how human interests are satisfied. It's a harmony of interests, and it's always changing what the needs are, and responsible people in their fields are looking to change. If fewer people are getting cancer, that's good. Let's switch to another specialty, particularly in a world where you're more free to switch specialties or do a different kind of cancer or a different kind of treatment. So I don't think it's true that there's a misalignment of interests or even a larger perception of misalignment of interests in medicine than there is in other fields. And I don't really think those were the arguments that were used to advance socialized medicine in the past. I think it was more these kind of edge cases of the woman who shows up at the hospital and can't afford treatment, and the people who have to rely on charity and how that's undignified because they couldn't find enough people dying in the corners to claim that was the issue. It's not precisely the doctors are greedy or you can't trust them, but it's that everyone describes themselves when they're being good as not being on a profit motive and not being selfish, and that colors how people view all these things. But I don't think it's that there's a particular distrust for doctors.
No, I think it works the other. So I don't think it's that we mistrust the doctors. I think it's that the doctors, their
Self-image prevent, as like I care about my patients, prevents them and prevented them in the past, or let's pushed against standing up and saying, look, this is bad for my business, this is bad for my freedom. It was much more, it made them, it disempowered them than I think it made us view them as kind of these monsters. And that's why I thought it was so shocking. Like, it really stuck with me when Obama, in his push for Obamacare, was attacking doctors and their motives. I hadn't seen that before. I hadn't seen a politician say doctors are performing unnecessary surgeries to make more money. Like, that was, I thought, new. I mean, I don't follow it as closely as you guys do, but I had never seen that before. I think it was more the disempowering of the medical profession of standing up for its ability to seek profits.
Art, did you want to?
Yeah, I just had one major comment on the idea before I didn't read it.
Oh, the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, these things be helpful for us when because obviously, like, food is a necessary good, and we haven't yet socialized that.
Well, we tried, and there were famines, and so the question is, food is a necessary good, and we haven't yet socialized it. But there were several attempts to socialize the production of food, and lots of people starved to death very suddenly, not even able to do the kind of work that people had been able to do under earlier forms of force. So what was retreated to was a more modest form of socializing food. So we have SNAP in the U.S. and other kind of provisions, and farm subsidies, yeah, which is a big one. Mm-hmm.
Just that it became effective, and that's why people felt it should be a right, or based on the history stuff, did you have another
So I do think it was one that became efficacious, because then that caused the rise of hospitals, and that caused some prices to go up because this was now something valuable that people would pay for. And you can think about, what don't they care about in medicine? They don't care if they don't want to socialize breast implant surgery or cosmetic Botox or LASIK surgery in your field. They don't, because they don't think of that as that value. It's not life or death. So when it became something that was instrumental for life or death, that's when people started to want it. That's when prices went up, and that's when and at the same time that was happening, they were socializing it like bit by bit. It wasn't like all of a sudden, like with Greg made this example. He just made this on your own Brook show a couple of days ago about the socialization of food, which he just mentioned. That we already knew that food could be grown and stuff, and then they socialized that, and then you saw famines. They didn't do that with healthcare. It was just like tit for tat. That innovation happened, and then there was socialization of that innovation. So it wasn't. So I think it wasn't that drastic, but it really was only when it became something that wasn't seen as frivolous, as a luxury for rich people who had a physician on call or a physician in the king's court, that type of thing. Once it actually had the ability to cure people and change their life for the better, that's when it became something they wanted to control. Just like the internet. I made that comment in my talk that nobody cared so much about internet until all of a sudden then it became, everybody should have broadband, because now it's so valuable to people's lives, and now it's instrumental in how you live your life. Then the government wants to have broadband access for everybody and control that and pay for it with taxes.
And this goes to Don's point about equality being the principle, the egalitarianism being the principle that's driving socialism in general and socialization of medicine in particular. People should be equal in their access to the things that are important in life. Everybody should, if something's important and it matters, everybody should have it, and everybody should have it equally, and they shouldn't have to do anything to get it. That's the premise. And so that premise, if you're on that premise, it's annoying when anybody has anything anybody else doesn't. But so long as the thing's not that important and it doesn't work, if Elon Musk wants to spend a lot of money trying to get to Mars, I mean, what a fanciful thing that he can do or whatever, and that you can't get to Mars doesn't matter because no one thinks he's really going to do it or it's really going to matter. But if he does get to Mars and then a few people are getting to Mars and a lot of good things are happening from their getting to Mars for them and some other people aren't participating in it, then there's going to be a right to get to Mars and it's going to be really important. So this is how things work. Once the thing works and it's making a real difference in people's life, whether they have it or not, then it becomes, particularly if it's a life and death difference, then it becomes a matter of great moral import that some people lack it.
Just think about organ transplant. The fact that they want that to be. This is the point he's making about equality or equity, is how they say it in healthcare. They've made it impossible. It's illegal to compensate an organ donor. So if you donate your kidney, that you'll go to jail, even if you've saved somebody's life by donating your kidney for $5. That would be illegal because it's all baked into this whole equity. There's even talk now, that.
The rationale for that is that wealthy people would then buy up all of the organs that are available, and then they wouldn't be available for those that were poor. Is that
Right, but they don't understand that would actually increase. They actually know the modeling shows that if you actually start increasing compensation, you will decrease donor lists because more people will donate, and we won't have people dying. 125,000 people die every year on donor lists. You wouldn't have that happen. They know that, but they don't want to. They don't want to give any kind of credence to the idea that people should be compensated, or that rich people. Some people will be able to buy a kidney or buy part of a liver lobe, and other people won't. And there's even talk, when people think about developing a drug for a disease, if it's going to cost a lot of money, some people will just say, well, it shouldn't even be developed then, if it's going to cost that much money. And when you see a news story about a breakthrough, almost within the first paragraph is something about what's the access to this drug going to be? Not that this was awesome. They figured out this major scientific discovery, like an RSV vaccine, that they figure all this stuff out, and they saw it took them decades to figure that out. Nobody talks about that. The articles about the RSV vaccine is, insurance companies are lagging, putting it on their list, and people having to pay $300 out of pocket. Not that this is something we didn't even have last year, and we have this year. It's so much baked into it that it has to be for everybody, or it shouldn't be at all. It's like when you're a little kid. If you don't bring enough gum for everybody, you can't chew that in classroom. That's what's happened with a lot of medical innovation. They don't even care about the innovation part. It's just everybody needs to be equally shabby.
The premise is if we all have to have it for everyone to have it, then there can't be anyone who's willing to put his resources, his time, his life into risking being the first for this, into paying extra to have it first when he thinks it can happen and other people don't, investing in it for himself, for his friends, and then the thing doesn't come about. And we're all dying for lack of the things that haven't come about for just this reason. Not just in medicine, but in so many other fields. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to bring up the issue of regulatory capture. I was talking to a lady a few days ago who told me, she said, my product competes with marijuana, and I sell it in states where marijuana is illegal because the marijuana industry has outlawed it. I mean, marijuana went from being illegal to lobbying to regulate the competition out of existence. I mean, we have to face up to the fact that for every Henry Reardon, there are 100 Orange Boyles now. We don't have the capitalists anymore. We just have people who want to lobby for corporate welfare. And that's part of what's making healthcare so expensive. What do we do about this? How do we get back to having actual capitalists instead of these cronies?
So I don't like the term regulatory capture because it implies that there's some alternative to it. Like there's such a thing as this priestly class of people who know enough to regulate an industry, but aren't part of that industry and don't have any interests. And somehow those people end up not being the regulators. It end up being people who have some interest at stake and probably who came from the industry. Who else could it possibly be who's the regulator, and who else has it ever been? Right? It's always... but I don't like this idea that we used to have capitalists and now we don't. We used to have kings and vicomtes, and it's just in the past 200 years that we've had anything like capitalism. There was a period where in some industries we had a lot more of it than we do now, but it's not clear to me that, and at that time, a lot of the regulations that came in now, antitrust law and other things, came at the behest of some of the business people at that time. The issue isn't that there aren't any real capitalists now and there used to be in the past. The issue is that we as a species don't understand that values come from the mind and the mind needs freedom. We don't understand that the right way to interact with one another is by trade to mutual advantage, by mutual consent with no victims. And so long as we as a species don't understand that, so long as most people don't understand that, most business people aren't going to understand it, and most voters aren't going to understand it. And so long as we're on that premise, there's going to be all kinds of temptations for all kinds of people to push for ways to get regulations passed that'll line their pocket and will hurt the next guy. Just like it's the same problem as why there's, petty crime. So long as people don't understand well enough what life is about and what living good is for, there are going to be people tempted to these things, and people are going to do them. And what we need is enough people who really understand what human living is about. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. And enough of a move in the general consensus about what human life is about to counter those trends when they happen, to make it less likely that people pushing for these kinds of regulations will succeed, to make it more likely that we'll be able to undo the regulations there are. And what we need more and more is the idea that life is not a competition. Life is not a zero-sum game. Life is not something that consists of people winning over other people who lose in order that the winners should win and profit. Human beings are not a species that competes with one another fundamentally. We're fundamentally a species that cooperates, that collaborates, and to do it, we need to be free. We need to be able to create more, and then to figure out who to work with to do that and who not to. And the more that perspective catches on, the more it's understood, the more people grasp the truth that there are no conflicts of interest between rational men who don't regard the unearned as possible and don't regard subjugation as practicable and sacrifice as practicable, the more this kind of thing will go away. But there's no substitute for that. There's no way to take people who believe that the way to succeed is to smash your club down on the next guy or get a whole bunch of other people together to vote for somebody to smash his club down on them. So long as people believe that, there's no hack to living well or to freedom. But what's striking is how few people believe that now relative to who did in the past. How much more pro-freedom the world population is now than they were 300 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or pretty much any time in history, but you can quibble about whether 75 years ago they were a bit better, or 80 or 150, and you'll find they were better in some respects and not in others. This defeatism is crazy when one thinks about the fact that people have lived in subjugation and force and feuding for all of human history until just like the last blink of an eye. And we're thinking about how we can maintain it, how we can grow it, how we can push back on the rolling back of it that we find in certain areas of life. We really have to appreciate how new and novel the idea of freedom is, how little understood it's ever been by anyone anywhere. And then think about what got it to the point where it was understood by enough people to double the human life expectancy, to enrich our lives tremendously on so many axes, and then how we get it the rest of the way there.
It seems like
By what was really successful?
Alex Epstein,
Alex, yeah.
is that he's focused on somewhat a limited issue, like about, like he's out there talking about why we need more fossil fuels and why renewables won't replace that. And he brings up broader issues, but for the most part, he's not making so many arguments about capitalism in general. Do you think that a challenge in arguing about how to desocialize medicine is that it's pretty obvious to many people that there's more fundamental issue there, which is freedom versus government control in general. So do you think there's value in trying to formulate arguments that can be specifically applied to medicine that don't bring up a broad argument about regulation in general, or trying to get behind specific, like start movements behind specific issues, like maybe specific regulation or specific, maybe like a movement about sugar doesn't bring up a full.
I don't think that the issue. So there's two things being blended together. I think both.
Alex is focused on energy issues, And I think there's a virtue in the healthcare movement where you have people who've really specialized and thought about freedom in this one area. I think the thing that makes energy a little bit easier, and it's easy to overstate, now that Alex did it, it's obvious how you would do it and how you would argue for it. But there is one more difficulty, which is that the front and center moral issue in energy is humanism versus anti-humanism. And more people will regard it as obviously better to be humanist than anti-humanist once the issue is made explicit. Whereas in healthcare, the fundamental moral issue is much more on the altruism, egoism axis, which in the end, the only way to be a humanist is to be an egoist. But that's not, it comes up less in the energy debate, though it does come up and Alex has to deal with it. And that makes it harder, I think, in healthcare. And there's also, so there's things like that pose unique challenges, but that's true in every area of freedom has unique challenges, and it's easy to overstate, well, it's easier in this area. But if the Alex Epstein of policy had come in healthcare first, we'd be saying, oh, well, obviously, now that he's figured out how to do this, it works here. But how are you going to do it in energy where people don't even value human life? So I don't think that you can make that like harder, easier kind of distinction.
I also worry about overstating Alex's success, right? The overwhelming majority of the world still believes that we need to stop burning fossil fuels post-haste, or else the planet's going to catch on fire in 15 minutes. And cost is no object in doing that. So if we have to, starve to death 2 billion people, well, so be it. We'll all die, an hour and a half later if we don't do it, and plus the algae will be better off, right? That's still the dominant view of energy. What Alex's achievement is on this is that it's now not the only view in energy, right? There are some people saying things counter to that, and the people who are around trying to say something counter to it before are saying it a lot better. But his side is still quite away from winning that fight. It's just, it's shocking to see any progress there after so long. And I think it will continue, and he's continuing to do good work, and I think there'll be more progress made there. But in order to make the more positive progress, to say, well, what is a proper policy? We can reject the policy of let's throw out tomorrow the thing that all of us are living on right now without a plan for how to fix it. That's not a good idea. All right, that is low-hanging fruit in the energy debate. It took a lot to even get people to recognize that point. But then what should the policy be? And Alex is calling it an energy freedom policy that he's advocating for. But what does that look like? How will it work? That he's going to have to address these same kind of issues to get past that one point. And he is addressing them to get past. But the more he's focused on moving forward on that issue, the more these other questions about individualism and rights and so forth are going to have to come more center stage. And so just in the healthcare question, those are more center stage first.
One area that's narrow in healthcare that's been successful is reproductive healthcare, where they've been able to focus on something very narrow and get the people behind them. If you look at the referendums after Roe v. Wade was overturned, you can see what's happened with every referendum. They've won, the pro-choice, pro-abortion side has been able to win. And that also applies to having oral contraceptives go over the counter, Plan B go over the counter, the mifepristone, which is a pill that can induce an abortion. That was something that had been banned, and people advocated directly on those things and were able to do that. And I think there might be lessons there. And I think a lot of people isolate reproductive healthcare from the rest of healthcare, but I think their success, I think the fact that they're successful, I think there's lessons to be drawn from how they were successful in the language they use. And often they do use the language of individual rights and freedom in a way that that you wouldn't expect them to. There's organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights. They're very clear about it. So I think there are places like that. And I think part of what, from Don's talk, we have to find areas like that where you can find a wedge issue like that something like that's to get your foot under the door and expand that and to use that language. And just one little anecdote is when there was a case here in Texas about abortion providers having to having to be on hospital grounds, or they have to have privileges to admit. I got asked by the Center for Reproductive Freedom because they read something I wrote in Forbes to join an amicus brief to the Supreme Court, which we wrote together, and we won that issue on that issue, and they used my language in that brief about freedom, that doctors have to have autonomy, they have to be able to, and patients need autonomy. This is an individual rights issue, and they're restricting trade by doing that, and it works. So there are ways to do this. You just have to find them all.
Yeah, the danger, or not the danger,
The problem, or I think the opportunity in reproductive health was created, I think, by a really negative phenomenon in the culture, which is it had a tribal alliance behind it that would be open to, like, got animated by it. But there's not like a tribal alliance on many better sides in the healthcare debate, whereas they're on the negative side, and that, so it's tricky to find those. But
I don't think the wanting reproductive rights is a tribal alliance. It's there are people who are tribal about it, like there is about every positive value, but it's one of the positive, good, actual concerns about individual rights that some people have that get wrapped up then in tribalism as every other concern does. What I worry about, I think two areas where the people who care about them in medicine are really concerned about individualism and individual rights are reproductive rights, reproductive medicine, and end of life. But the horror in using that to fight for freedom of medicine is that, for what I think are somewhat accidental historical reasons, and we talk about what the reasons are, is that people who tend to be more pro-capitalism, or they're not pro-capitalism, the people who tend to hate capitalism less, are mystics who don't like reproductive freedom and don't like the freedom to end your life when you're suffering. And so long as that's the case, the areas of healthcare in which people are most sensitive to actual individual rights issues are going to be areas where there's not going to be an alliance to the people who are most market friendly. And we can think about how it came to be that there's this odd alliance between religionists and semi-free marketeers for so much of recent history. It's not an alliance that ever made sense, and it's not an alliance that could ever affect freedom. But nonetheless, it is, how the political parties have shaked out for a while. Now I think the last of the free marketeers are being jettisoned from the right anyway, so I don't think even that semi-alliance will be there in 10 years. But nevertheless, so long as you have this, it's going to be very hard to use those as a wedge issue to make progress towards medical freedom, but it is the area where people are most, I think, concerned about individual rights issues in medicine. Yeah.
On the subject of tactics,
The subject of what? Tactics. I think it would have to be tied to capping the program. So the question is, would it be a step, because I don't know if people can hear, would it be a step in the right direction to transition Medicare to a system where seniors are given, written a check, right? And then they could use that check to buy health insurance or for any other purpose. Maybe it would be put in an HSA for them or something so that it would be limited to the medical field. Would it be a step in the right direction or a wrong direction? This is the kind of thing that requires some study and thought about. I don't think you could say, just on a moment's reflection, but I think it would really depend on whether it's tied to capping the expenses of the program. So if the idea is we're now going to let the average amount somebody gets from Medicare over their life is however many dollars, you can probably tell me, but it's $12,000 a year. So we're going to write everybody who wants to $12,000 checks, but if they end up having greater expenses, they can go back and get them, and other people can still get more than $12,000 if they want. So we're going to give everybody the average, but the people who expect they're going to have greater costs don't take it, and so that then you're just going to have Medicare costs going up and up and up, and you're just going to have expanded the entitlement. But if it's considered and sold and understood all along as a part of changing and reforming this entitlement, so we're freezing the Medicare budget at what it was this year. There's a defined amount that people can take out in Medicare benefits, and we're not going to pay for anything. We're only going to pay for up to $12,000 or whatever number it is a year. and it's capped, but now you can take it in cash and do whatever you want with it. And then you sell that as trust seniors and so forth, and trust seniors and make our, entitlement state more responsible and so forth. I think that could really be a step in the right direction. But it has to be tied to not creating new entitlements and letting things grow. And ideally to a plan to shrink it in the longer term. So trust current seniors and also trust young people to opt out long term and so forth.
Although I would never have trust seniors as a message. Like the whole perspective is I get to sit around and decide who's trustworthy, right? Like, well, I had to think about it, but it wouldn't be that. But there's something there. It's respect seniors versus we treat them as children, and that's outrageous. But
So respect rather than trust.
Yeah.
All right, we are at time. So I want to thank everybody for staying with us, and I want to thank all the panelists and speakers for their contribution, and all of you online. Thank you. And the next steps are up to you and to some of us.